V1.
Pull up, pull up, pull up. Terrain, terrain, pull up, terrain.
Welcome to the Flight Safety Detectives. Hosts John Golia and Greg Fife, two of the world's most respected aviation safety experts, talk all things related to aviation and aerospace. This podcast and the Flight Safety Detectives YouTube channel are brought to you by the Professional Aviation Maintenance Association, PAMA, and Avemco Insurance, a world-class provider of aviation insurance and your one stop for all general aviation insurance needs. Get a customized quote at avemco.com or give them a call at 888-879-0389. Tell them you're a listener of the show and receive a 5% discount. Now it's time to buckle up because it's wheels up for the latest episode of Flight Safety Detectives.
Well, hello, gentlemen. It is another episode of Flight Safety Detectives. It's good to see you both. We have a kind of an interesting accident this week because the investigation is still ongoing. It's a relatively new accident. The airplane crashed in June of this year, 2022. And so the NTSB is still in the process of doing their investigation and, of course, the associated activities. What we want to do at this show today is talk about some of the things that we think the board should be looking at to try and figure out the probable cause for this particular accident. Every accident is sad, but this one is very sad because it was a young lady who had recently gotten a private pilot certificate, and she was flying with her young child, son. And apparently these two places in Texas, she spent a lot of time, bouncing between the two. So she had some familiarity, and I'll turn it over to you, Todd, in a second to talk about it. But, when you start looking at an accident like this and you look at the prelim, the NTSB gave you basically some of the facts, but they, it's not very detailed. They just basically said, here's an accident, it happened, we're out there looking at it, and we'll get back to you with what we find after we spend 12 or 18 months pondering what's going on. And based on the facts that they did present, and some of the pictures that are coming from the accident site, it's obvious that this airplane struck the ground not in a relatively flat attitude, but in a left wing low, nose low attitude at a pretty good vertical speed. And so getting into the dynamics of this accident and what the investigators should be looking at, Todd, I know that you scoured the internet, you looked at some of the social media posts and that kind of stuff. Can you give us a little bit of background on this particular pilot and some of the things that she was doing in the past?
Well, certainly. Like a lot of the accidents we followed, this was a general aviation fatal event. But for me, it caught my eye because when I was scanning Catherine's report, this was a crash that happened not too far from where I grew up in South Texas, about 50 miles from San Antonio, 60 miles from San Antonio, where I grew up. And there are a few things that stood out about this. One of them being there was a lot of social media profile, a high social media profile from this pilot. She had posted numerous things on Facebook and Instagram. And from that, I was able to get some information that gave some context as to what kind of pilot she was. She owned this aircraft, soloed in the aircraft, got her license, private license. And looking at flight radar 24, there had been a number of flights that were made with this aircraft in and around her home airport. And specifically, several on this route that was the one she took on her fatal flight from New Braunfels down to Kennedy Airport. That's one end in South Texas. And this was something that she had done, again, at least 4 times in the previous 4 months. And this was a relatively short flight, about a half hour or so. And as Greg mentioned, the other thing that struck me about this is that this was not just her on the aircraft, this was also her young son. So there's all that emotional side of it that comes into this. This was a person from her social media profile, very active, hard charger, She was a registered nurse. She was working in New Braunfels, like I said, about 60, 70 miles north of where the crash happened, and lived on a ranch with her family. Very proud of her family, water skiing, picnics, all sorts of a wonderful life, in other words. And you would think, well, this is the kind of person, very forward looking with her life in general, very dedicated toward aviation, quite proud of her achievements. And what seems to be a routine flight went wrong a mile or so from her destination. And I'm sure the NTSB might get into more details with the technical side of this, but looking at literally the social side of it, the social media side of it, this didn't come across as a pilot who was slipshod, or a pilot who was cutting the corners, a pilot who was not trying to do things in her life.
And when you look at the route of flight, it's relatively a straight shot all the way into the intended runway for landing. I mean, you didn't really have to alter course a whole heck of a lot to land on the runway based on the wind that particular day for the runway. And if you look at the flight aware data, you can see that it tracks pretty much true right to the airport, and she just made a slight adjustment. And it was less than a mile from the end of the runway that all of a sudden something bad happened with regard to her being able to control the airplane. There were some altitude deviations in the very final seconds of the flight. John, when we look at this, the board's going to be looking at a variety of different things. Of course, you can't rule out a mechanical malfunction or failure.
Not at all. In fact, I would put that high on the list to look at physical evidence. We just did an accident where a simple bracket, the securing of a simple bracket for the throttle, caused a helicopter to crash. So, it just so happened that about 2 hours ago, I was looking at an older accident in the desert of the Grand Canyon, Las Vegas area, sightseeing helicopter, where a mechanic failed to put a cotter into a castellated nut. It came loose and it lost control of the helicopter. So helicopters have long been known for shaking and baking. And if there's any hardware that's not properly secured, it doesn't last long on a helicopter.
And when you look at this is a 182G, so it's of course a single engine piston airplane, but the G gives it away that it is an older model Cessna. It's back, aged in the 70s. But, that really doesn't matter in aviation as long as the airplane is being maintained in accordance with manufacturers' maintenance schedules and, of course, the federal aviation regulations. But when you start looking at an older airplane like this, of course, looking at the maintenance records is going to be critical to see what type of maintenance history this airplane has. When was the last most recent maintenance done on the airplane, and what kind of maintenance did they do? Were they doing anything with flight control cables? Were they doing anything with any of the flight controls themselves that could have caused or contributed to a loss of control by the pilot in these final stages of the flight? And then, of course, we also have to look at, yes, her experience. Todd gave us a bit of a background, but the NTSB in their prelim didn't put any kind of total flight time or recency of experience. That will be a big factor to look at. But as an investigator, I would also be going back to her flight instructor or flight instructors, if she had multiple flight instructors, to be talking to them about basically her talent. That is her character, how she handled the airplane, what kind of decision-making, skills that she employed in her flying. That particular day, like you said, Todd, yeah, the weather wasn't it wasn't bad. It was clear. If you look at the pictures right after the accident, it's blue sky, sunshine. Problem is that there was a significant gusty wind, 15 gusting to over 24 knots, which, again, it doesn't sound like much. And the way the wind was oriented, it was pretty much down the runway she was going to be landing at. But pilots, especially inexperienced pilots, don't add in, for those gusty wind conditions, a little extra airspeed. because with gusty winds, there are a couple things that happen, of course, and that is, one, it's not a steady state wind, so you're not into a steady headwind or even a slight, quartering headwind. You do have the gust loads, and you do have the fact that if the wind stops blowing or slows down, the bottom tends to fall out, and then all of a sudden you get hit with another little gust of wind. So you're always wanting to carry a little extra airspeed so that you do maintain that altitude control. And when you look at the flight aware data with these pitch perturbations that were taking place right before they lost the final data points, that could be indicative that she's fighting a bit of a crosswind, or at least a quartering headwind that's very gusty. And she's right, she's flying the numbers. A lot of these pilots, fly the numbers. Well, again, you may not want to use full flaps in gusty wind conditions. You may want to use half flaps. So looking at the wreckage, John, one of the things that the board's going to have to look at is really documenting the configuration of the airplane.
Well, I was thinking earlier when I was looking at this accident, where would an investigator have to go? Right, so you got the obvious problem with did she lose power? So you're going to have to give a good look at the engine to make sure that it was functioning properly. Of course, you need to look at the fuel right off the bat to make sure it wasn't something as dumb as running out of fuel or having the wrong tank selected. I mean, so those are right off the bat. The flight controls, very suspect. So whether they were operating properly or was there a problem? Over the past year, we have looked at a number of accidents that were caused by the loss of cotter pin. I just mentioned a few on helicopters, but we've also had them on airplanes. In fact, you and I did the Emory hearing on that, where a mechanic simply forgot to put the cotter pin in, and over time it worked its way loose, and he had an elevator problem. So and then there's a number of mechanical issues and airplane issues that this investigator is going to have to dig in on. And unfortunately, he's most likely a single investigator. And let's hope he doesn't stop short just because he finds something and doesn't go to the other areas to make sure that he's covered all the bases. Given what I'm hearing out of the NTSB directly, talking to the board members, a couple of board members, resources are so thin, and we not even getting into that, just to take it at face value, that resources are so thin. Does that mean that we're really going to get the shot shuffled on all these airplanes? I mean, it's been obvious to everybody in the business now for the last 8 years at least that the NTSB has not been putting the effort into general aviation accidents that they used to. And it's frustrating a lot of people, including the insurance companies, the manufacturers to a certain extent, and of course the family members are feeling the pain, as you say, if the investigators hit the big red easy button, and blame it on the pilot and just move on.
And there are two other things, two small things about this event, which I hope that they will address at some point. She was the pilot in command, and she had, I believe, her 6-year-old son with her. So again, one of the things that came to mind is, was there a problem with either the child being unbelted or with the FOD inside the cabin? Who knows what? That might have fouled up the controls. The other thing is, she had come from her job as a nurse in New Braunfels, which again, the origin of the flight. And my question is, was this after a normal shift? Was this after a double shift? Was there a fatigue issue here? That's something where even with a single investigator, in my mind, a few phone calls just with her colleagues saying, hey, what was her state of mind, her state of physical being after she left from her shift, picked up her child from wherever, and then went to the airport?
Well, you bring up a good point, Todd, and just expanding on the fact that she had a child in the airplane is, where was that child? Was that child in a safety seat? Was that child sitting in the front seat? Was that child sitting in the back seat? Given the fact that the ride was probably bumpy due to the gusty wind conditions, was there a problem with motion sickness? Was somebody getting sick? Was there a diversion of attention? If the child was sitting in the front seat, did that child inadvertently grab the flight controls, given the fact that, one, you shouldn't fly with a child in the front seat, and hopefully that child was in a safety seat. But if that young boy wasn't, that's a big issue right there. Those are survival factors aspects of it, but it could also be contributory to a scenario where you may have had flight control interference or distraction or a variety of other things. So there is a lot of investigation to be done with this accident. It's not just a simple, let's go out, kick the tin, see if, the flight controls work, the engine was running, and just write this off to pilot error and failed to maintain control of the airplane or failed to maintain altitude or whatever, which seems to be a very simplistic, easy button probable cause that we're seeing out of the NTSB these days. So hopefully the investigator will dig into a lot of these issues, and it doesn't come up as an unknown and things like that, because it'll be very frustrating, like you said, John, not only for the families, but it's frustrating for the three of us, the flight safety detectives, when, again, we may have a follow-up show and talk about this very accident with a probable cause that we've always been talking about is incomplete. It doesn't tell the real story. It's not an educational outcome for pilots reading this particular accident. It seems, you start reading the social media parts of Catherine's report, and everybody's an expert and wants to chime in on what happened and that kind of stuff. But we got to let the facts play out, and hopefully the investigator will develop all the facts, conditions, and circumstances that will lead us to a reasonable and logical probable cause for this very unfortunate accident.
Yes, this accident could prove to be very complicated in actually doing it, because there are so many unanswered questions. And Todd, as you were talking about the work schedule, one of my daughters worked in the Mass General Hospital trauma unit for a number of years. And I can tell you that on quite a few occasions, she would come home from work and wouldn't be fit to do anything because of what she had seen and what she had been involved in. So going back to the hospital, if she had worked prior shift just before this flight, is something I would put very high on the list to talk to those people to make sure that she wasn't in that state.
Well, we'll be posting the link to Catherine's report. There is always some good information, including pictures and of course the flight tracks and that kind of thing. And this is an accident that we will be following, hopefully to fruition if it happens within the next 18 months. I'm hoping that it happens sooner than that. But again, we'll watch this accident and come back to what the NTSB determines as a probable cause. So with that, gentlemen, I know that Todd, you're always itching to give us some pearls of wisdom before the master closes us out.
Well, the two of you actually inspired me to give these next to last words, because while you were talking, I thought, I'm racking my brains here. I can't recall any advisory circular or any industry publication, let's say from IOPA, that addresses how to fly with children. The very issues you mentioned. What are some common sense things you can and can't do, or should not do when it comes to children? And let's face it, for a lot of families, flying is a family affair. And although you want to have discipline inside of the cabin, sometimes that discipline is absolutely essential for safety. And perhaps this is an opportunity for someone in an official capacity to step up and say, look, here are some rules of the road when it comes to flying with children. If you don't do this, there might be some problems.
And that's why I invented a child safety seat for these very things, because car seats, even though they're quote approved for use on airplanes, they aren't designed for airplane seats. And when you look at the airplane seat on a commercial airliner versus an airplane seat in a general aviation airplane, it's very diverse. And you don't get the same leverage when you're trying to belt that seat in. You don't have the over-the-shoulder straps or anchor points in a lot of general aviation airplanes. This is an older airplane, so we know for sure it didn't. And if somebody did put this seat, a child safety seat or a booster seat, in the front seat, hoping to use the shoulder harness, Was it properly secured? It's not a proper technique. There's a lot of good information that could come out of this particular accident. It may not be causal or contributing, but it could sure form the basis for writing a recommendation for general aviation pilots flying with young children in either a child safety seat or a booster seat. So,
Hope
John,
springs eternally.
Close this out as I always do.
Hope springs eternally that they'll do a very robust and across all of those different functional areas in the report. But you know what? I'm not going to hold my breath, because we've seen just too many reports lately that leave so many holes, so many unanswered questions, and so many places where improvements could have been made, and they're not because the detail is missing.
Yeah,
so
I agree. I know.
As always, I will remind everybody that if you're going to go flying, do a good pre-flight analysis before you go. Do it before you even leave your house. Do it again at the airport. Remember to check the weather from here, there, and everything in between. When you get out to your airplane, do a good pre-flight. The accidents I mentioned that I was looking at earlier today, several of them, the pre-flights were lacking, and the cause of the accident may have been able to have been discovered before the takeoff if they had done a decent pre-flight. So you got to do a decent pre-flight. If you don't know how to do one, I keep saying this, find a mechanic that works on the airplane that can help you through what's important on a pre-flight. And after you get in the air, put that head on the swivel. I mentioned you got that mid-air right in your backyard, Greg, just less than a week ago. They're happening all too frequently now. So put that head on a swivel and pay attention to what's going on around you. And please fly safely.
To listen or watch more episodes of this show, go to flightsafetydetectives.com, the Flight Safety Detectives YouTube channel, or your favorite place to listen to podcasts. To contact John and Greg about the show, send them an email at flightsafetydetectives@gmail.com. And remember, for aviation insurance needs, contact Avemco Insurance at avemco.com or give them a call at 888-879-0389. Mention Flight Safety Detectives and receive a 5% discount. Thanks for listening to the Flight Safety Detectives, and remember to always fly safe.